Hello everyone, Juxtaposition here. Happy New Year's Eve 2022. What awaits us in 2023 is Lord only knows, anybody's guess, right? Well, you know they're going to continue the war that we're in. It's going to continue, and things are going to tighten up, and we'll have some psychological events occur, of course, we always do. And this is the time of year that people look back on the year that was 2022. I'm not going to do that because I like to go a few years out from the year to re-examine it from a greater distance when I have more intel, because a lot happened in 2022. I think you know that. We went from face diapers to no face diapers. We went to going back to work, even if you weren't vaccinated. Most corporations will allow you to come back even if you're unvaxxed. Not so with the government or at hospitals. They seem to be really draconian there. Of course, who the hell wants to go to a courthouse or a hospital in 2022? I mean, those places are creepy. It'd be like wanting to go have brunch at Auschwitz or Dachau concentration camps, as far as I'm concerned. I don't want anything to do with them, and I don't want anything to do with the people who collect paychecks from those institutions, whom I do not trust. All right, so what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to look back on the year that was 1969, and to properly set the table, like my mother taught me, I want to briefly look at 1967 and briefly look at 1968 as a prelude to 1969. Remember that the CIA and the Tavistock Institute declared, Tavistock Institute is British intelligence, if you don't know. Anyway, Tavistock Institute is in London, England, in central London, near the banking center, and very close proximity to where Judy Garland was murdered, and in closer proximity to where Roberto Calvi, the number one private banker of the world in 1982, where he was hung by an orange rope with a love knot under the Blackfriars Bridge. The Tavistock Institute is walking distance from that death scene. Oh, yes. It was declared a suicide, of course, but it's impossible that it was a suicide, okay? Unless you had a boat and a crew. Whenever I hear the word suicide, you should immediately think homicide. That's what we've learned watching my channel. Where we answer the age-old question, does correlation equal causation? And I think we know when it comes to clandestine services, the answer is an emphatic yes. Yes, it does. Yes, correlation does equal causation. 100%. Not 89%, not 99%, 100%. I'd love to have Judy Garland here to interview, and she could explain it better than I. I mean, she's the one that cracked the code with the Wizard of Oz and what happens when you don't follow the Elbrook Road and you go off into the weeds and get those flying monkeys. But there was Judy Garland, Dorothy, and she didn't get killed by the flying monkeys. In fact, I believe she accidentally tossed a bucket of water on Evelyn, the Wicked Witch of the West, over there at Sequoia Capitol. She threw a bucket of water on her and she dissolved, sort of like the World Trade Center 3 towers, Building 1, Building 2, and Building 7. It's kind of like the Wicked Witch of the West. Yeah. I mean, Wicked Witch of the East, we know what happened to her. Dorothy landed her house on her. She crushed her to get those ruby slippers. Anyway, that's a banking documentary. That was about centralized bank digital currency. Just, I don't think anyone told Judy Garland that that was what the hidden message was. But I'm telling you right now, Frank Morgan was the private banker. He was the Roberto Calvi. Frank Morgan, whose brother was the first president of the Screen Actors Guild of Hollywood. And I believe he was a 2-term president, whereas Ronald Reagan has the most. Ronald Reagan was 6 terms. Ronald Reagan, who became president of the fake United States of America. Ronald Reagan, he was the fake governor of California before he was the fake governor of the United States. He was the fake president of the CIA, Hollywood, OSS. Well, it was CIA when he took office of Screen Actors Guild. So Ronald Reagan was the CIA president of the Screen Actors Guilds for 6 years. And he also helped open the CIA Walt Disney Disneyland concept, where we brainwash children using corporate themes in an orange grove in Orange County, California, in July 1955, along with his friend Art Linkletter and Bob Cummings, with Fess Parker riding the pony down Main Street. Fess Parker. And I've personally met Fess Parker multiple times. I've personally met Ronald Reagan one time. And I've never met Bob Cummings, and I've never met Art Linkletter. Although I had a near miss with Art Linkletter, but did not connect up with him. I also did not meet, but was entertained by Buddy Rich, who played at Disneyland, and also the Count Basie Orchestra, who I saw Count Basie personally. And of course, I've been to the Tonight Show, and I did meet Doc Severinsen, and I met Johnny Carson. So in Burbank, California. The most impressive thing about the Tonight Show by NBC was the Tonight Show Orchestra, which is the Doc Severinsen band. It's impressive. Very impressive. I enjoyed him much more than I enjoyed Buddy Rich at Disneyland. And Buddy Rich was great, it's interesting, but I think that the Doc Severinsen band was more appealing to me, at a wider range. It didn't emphasize the drummer on everything. Buddy Rich had an ego the size of Long Island. Doc Severinsen was a real professional guy, very professional and super skilled trumpet player. And I used to play the trumpet, so I'm a fan of Herb Alpert, and I'm a big fan of the Tonight Show Orchestra, who was really run by Doc Severinsen. All right, so just very quick, like a bunny rabbit, 1967 was declared as the Summer of Love. And in January 1967, we had Apollo 1 on the launch site for a test. They weren't going to the moon. And Gus Grisham was the captain of the ship. He was 40 years old. And he, of course, had expressed his disdain for the Apollo program. And he's Apollo 1. And he said that they aren't going to the moon any time in the next 20 years, okay? Even he got in trouble for saying that. And then he put a lemon on a coat hanger over the command module, which was photographed as his nonverbal way of describing what he thought of the Apollo program, that it's a lemon. Well, anyway, he was murdered at the launch site along with 2 of his crewmen. And then the fellow that sealed him in on the door, he was later murdered with his family, got hit by a railroad train on the railroad tracks in Florida after he testified in a secret hearing about the Apollo 1 death of Gus Grisham. That sums up my take on the Apollo program, which was a Richard Nixon presidency exclusive program. 7 trips to the moon, 6 landings of the moon, all occurring under the Richard Milhous Nixon presidency. That's 7 trips to the moon in 3 years, okay? 1969 through 1972. 6 trips to the moon in 7 years. 6 successful. No fatalities. Once you got that Gus Grisham skeptic out of the way, 100% success. On television. And Walter Cronkite will tell you so. So will David Brinkley and Chet Huntley of NBC. They'll tell you so too. But I will tell you that it was a television show much in the same way that William Shatner, a Jewish man from Canada, Star Trek was a television show that preceded the Apollo program. Star Trek, with Leonard Nimoy and William Shatner, who would have been divorced 4 times, except one of his wives ended up getting murdered. So he burned through 4 wives, but he was the captain of the Starship Enterprise, and he always succeeded on his missions, along with Leonard Nimoy, who's a Jewish man from Boston, Massachusetts. Leonard Nimoy, Mr. Spock, also appeared in one Columbo, whereas William Shatner appeared in 2 Columbos, where his alibi as the killer was superior to his alibi of his third wife, Noreen, 28 years his junior. All right, so I'm going to then tell you that my feelings about 1967 kicked off with the murder of Gus Grisham on Apollo 1. They were immediately followed up by Timothy Leary, a longtime West Point attendee. Timothy Leary, longtime CIA soldier, LSD, psilocybin, tune in, turn on, drop out. And he uttered those words in San Francisco in January 1967. He repeated those words at Sharon Meadow, which is across the street from the Jesuit campuses, plural, of Lone College for Women and University of San Francisco and St. Ignatius de Loyola High School, which are all across the street from Sharon Meadows, now named Robin Williams Field. Robin Williams, a CIA comedian, living in Tiburon, who died in the same manner that John Benet Ramsey did. And they said that he committed suicide. But did they say that John Benet Ramsey committed suicide? She died in the same way. Same way as Anthony Bourdain did in northern France. Same way as David Carradine did in Bangkok, Thailand. Same way as Thomas Albert Decker did in his bathtub in Hollywood. Not West Hollywood, more like East Hollywood. East of the Hollywood freeway, a couple of blocks. But not that far from Franklin Avenue and the Magic Castle and the Dolby Academy Awards Theater. Not that far away. You could walk from Thomas Albert Decker, television and film star, murdered in his bathtub, I believe, in 1968. All right, so I've leapfrogged from 1967 into the Summer of Love, 1967, and then we moved into 1968 when Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski had their fake staged for television and photography wedding reception. They never had a wedding, as far as I know, at all, ever. They went to the Chelsea registry to take out some papers. Never saw them. There's no record of their wedding license. But they had a 2-hour cocktail party at the Playboy Club, which shares the same building as the Church of Scientology and the Process Church, which at that time, in January 1968, was labeled the Church of Compulsion Analysis. It was a division of Church of Scientology. So in other words, Church of Scientology uses space in the same building that the Hugh Hefner Playboy Club does, and the Sharon Tate, Roman Polanski dressed as Austin Powers, that's where Austin Powers got his wardrobe, right, was what Roman Polanski was wearing, Edwardian costumes. That was on a Friday afternoon, and there was a work day. They got married on a work day, a Friday, because it was a work day. Sharon got paid, Roman got paid, all the guests were paid. None of the parents were there. There was no parents for Roman Polanski. There's no Doris and Colonel Paul Tate of Presidio San Francisco. He wasn't present. So you got a fake wedding because the parents of Sharon Tate are not present. Neither are her sisters. So it's not a real wedding. It's a made-for-television fake wedding. It can be a fake marriage, which only lasts 17 and a half months, so very short. This is all coming before Judy Garland gets killed. We're going to come to that in a second. All right, so then later in 1968, after this fake wedding for Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski, we have the Milai Massacre, which occurred at 7:30 in the morning on a Saturday morning near Da Nang, in multiple villages known as Milai. There are other names that I don't know. But anyway, it's a group of villages inside this zip code area that we refer to as Milai. On March 16th, 1968, about 100 United States Army men and 50 or so stayed back to guard the perimeter of the villages there of Milai. And they entered the village and proceeded to murder 504 women and children and pregnant women and shoot pigs, kill pigs. They killed pigs at Milai using, of course, the M16 rifle and the M7 bayonet attachment. The exact weapon used to kill Sharon Tate and Abigail Folger a year and a half later in 1969, which I'm going to get to in a second. So anyway, the news media went black on that. There was no Walter Cronkite story on Milai, so nobody knew that it happened except for the soldiers that were there. They knew. And they're not talking. because we follow orders or people die. And you have an oath of secrecy, oath of obedience. So let me now move into 1969, the year that I want to review. I have 16 events that occurred during 1969. Obviously, there were thousands of events. We're only going to cover 16. I'm going to run through them pretty quickly so that I don't keep you waiting too long. We'll circle back to a couple of them, and if you have specific questions, do post them below. All right, so Walter Cronkite and the CBS Masonic Evil Eye feature huge because back in 1969, there were really only two sources to get your fake news. And the number one source was the William S. Paley World War II, director of propaganda for war propaganda World War II out of London, England, was William S. Paley. And he owns 15% of CBS Columbia Broadcasting System, 15%. So he's like the Jeff Bezos of his day. Because the company's worth over $1 billion, he has 15% of it. That's over 150 million. That's like Jeff Bezos type money today. That meant he's worth like $15 billion in 1969. Equivalency. So William Paley's the boss. He's the president, CEO, and also chairman of the board of directors. But it's a CIA operation, CBS, just like Amazon is a CIA operation. Amazon owns Sony. Sony owns MGM and TriStar Pictures. That means that Amazon owns Oliver Stone. That means Amazon owns Whole Foods. That means Amazon owns Hollywood. That's what that means. That means it owns Paul McCartney's music. And that meant it used to own Sharon Tate's contract, but she didn't renew it. So what are you going to do about that? All right, so what first happened, I'm going to pick March 13th, 1969. Paul McCartney makes the first move. Paul McCartney has been living with, not just dating, but he's living with Jane Asher since 1962. He's been living with Jane Asher. First in her parents' home. That's very similar to the Robert Wagner living with Natalie Wood at 7708. Woodrow Wilson Drive atop Laurel Canyon. Robert Wagner is living with age 18 Natalie Wood in her parents' home. Yeah. Paul McCartney is living with a age 18 Jane Asher in her parents' home. She's 18 years old over by Piccadilly Circus. That's where Jane Asher's parents lived. And they know, guess what? They're good friends with the fifth Beatle, right? What was his name? George. What's his name? The fifth Beatle? George Martin. George Martin took music lessons with Jane Asher's mother, but he spent a lot of time with the Asher family. So, of course, it made sense that Paul McCartney would live with George Martin's friends, the Ashers, right? So that's kind of a control mechanism, right? Because I can assure you that Brian Epstein is not managing the Beatles. CBS Columbia Records and RCA Victor is managing the Beatles' music. They're deciding the lyrics and the publishing based on whatever the Tavistock Institute tells them. And that the Jane Asher family is participating in a surveillance operation over Paul McCartney, who then, when he gets a little money in 1963, moves and gets his own, or he's assigned a home at 7 Cavendish Avenue over by Regency Park, where Brian Epstein was assigned as a soldier in the Royal Army before he was outed as a homosexual and wearing officer uniform in Piccadilly Circus, again, the Asher neighborhood. It's also the theater district of London, and that's what compromised Brian Epstein in the late 1950s. Brian Epstein was completely controlled by the Royal Army, who forced him to see a psychologist in lieu of putting him in the stockade and spending years in prison for impersonating an officer. And they also knew he was a homosexual. So Brian Epstein did what he was supposed to do, which is go find a group in Liverpool and sign them to a contract. And that could have been another band than John Lennon and Paul McCartney. But it ended up being Paul McCartney and John Lennon. But it could have been another band. And he did sign other bands. The Beatles are not the only band that Brian Epstein represented. That said, he's the fake representative because, again, the record contract, the record company who controls the radio frequency and the distribution of your song, they're in charge. And they're always in charge. And it's really not a secret in the music industry. If you want to get paid decent money, you got to perform live concerts. And then they don't care about that money. You can have it. But obviously you got to pay a lot of help and you got to rent the venues. And they can control whether you get those dates. So you got to do a deal with the devil like Bill Graham, Wolf Grajonka, right? So Paul McCartney, on March 13th, 1969, he finds himself in bed with Marcy Swartz, who's about 24 years old. She gets flown in from Manhattan, New York, to torpedo the Jane Asher situation by staying overnight at Paul McCartney's home at 7 Cavendish Avenue. Jane Asher returns early from her business trip and discovers all this, and so that Asher relationship is effectively torpedoed, and the Marcy Swartz relationship goes on for about 5 or 6 more months in 1968. And then Linda Epstein, who you think her name is Eastman. No, it's not. It's Epstein. Okay, she's a Jewish girl from Scarsdale, New York. So she's flown over from New York. So first we had Marcy Swartz gets flown to London from New York, and she spends about 6 months living with Paul McCartney at 7 Cavendish Place after Jane Asher's clothes are removed by Jane Asher's mother, who's a friend of George Martin's. Just want you to know this as background information. Paul McCartney was controlled by the Asher family first. Then he was controlled by Marcy Swartz. And then he was switched out for Linda Epstein Eastman, whose father gets power of attorney over him. Her father's name is Leopold Eastman. Leopold Epstein. Goes by Leisman. And he lives in New York, and he's an entertainment lawyer. So he's got power of attorney over Paul. Paul doesn't really have any control over his career because it's controlled by CBS and RCA Victor, who decide what songs he's going to play and what gets on the album, along with George Martin helping. He's the adult supervision in the room, George Martin. But George Martin is not in charge either. He has a boss he has to report to in the clandestine services. Anyway, so Paul McCartney gets married to Linda Epstein on March 13th, 1969. 7 days later, John Lennon eventually then marries Yoko Ono. That is Yoko Ono's 4th marriage. Yoko Ono was married 3 times before she met John Lennon. 3 times. Now, in fairness, she was married 3 times to 2 men. And she comes from nobility, private banking status in Tokyo, Japan. And so she's clandestine services all the way, as are her mother and as her father, who's an elite private banker in Hanoi, in Tokyo, in San Francisco, and in Manhattan, New York. Yoko Ono's father. So she gets flown in. Don't you see the trend here? We fly in Marcy Swartz to go see Paul McCartney. And she ends up in his bed. Then we fly from New York to London to see Paul McCartney. Then we fly in Yoko Ono to London to see Paul McCartney. And he sends her to see John Lennon, who she gloms onto. Then we fly Linda Epstein from New York to London to see Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney gets 3 visits from New York ladies. Marcy Swartz is Jewish. Okay? Linda Epstein is Jewish. And Yoko Ono is not Jewish. She's Japanese. But he gets 3 visits from 3 women. He sends one to John Lennon, who's on his 2nd marriage. So Yoko's on her 4th, and John Lennon's on his 2nd. All right, so you got that going on. Then that's March 20th. Then immediately, 6 days later, Yoko Ono and John Lennon arrive in Amsterdam to promote Bet In for Peace, which is basically an assault against the Vietnam War and the United States invasion of Vietnam. And that's held at the Hilton Hotel. Keyword there, Hilton Hotel. The Hilton Hotel is where a lot of CIA events occur. You know, that's where Lockheed Skunk Works has their annual Christmas party, is at the Beverly Hills Hilton Hotel. That is where the Bart Cybrel accosted Buzz Aldrin at the Beverly Hills Hilton Hotel, right? Because guess what? Bart Cybrel works for CIA. And you know that Buzz Aldrin, Apollo 11 astronaut who walked on the moon, he works for CIA too. And they had this little altercation, right? That's a staged event. It's not real. Bart Cybrel is to the Apollo mission what Richard Gage is to the 9/11 architects and engineers truth movement. In other words, he's a infiltrated, fake person. He's a crisis actor. Richard Gage is a crisis actor. Bart Cybrel is a crisis. Hey, go check out their backgrounds. You can't even find a birth date for Richard Gage or a birth date for Bart Cybrel. What architect firm did Richard Gage ever work for? I mean, he had completely quit after he was involved with architects and engineers. He said, you know, no more engineering work for me. And he never learned a damn thing in the next 16 years. Never learned anything. And he's living with a chemical engineering genius for the Department of Energy weapon system, and that guy knows more in his pinky finger than you ever heard Richard Gage speak ever in his life. So that means he's a cover artist, because he has lots of access to high technology weapon information, and he never shared it with architects and engineers. Never. That's why he was a big shot at architects and engineers, to prevent them from getting to the root of the problem. Because there is a weapon system that took out the buildings at World Trade Center, and that is to be remained concealed. And Richard Gage is part of the concealment. He's not there to find the truth. He's there to hide the truth. Don't you get it? And that's what Bart Cybrel is to the Apollo program. He's trying. I mean, who gave him $5,000 to offer these astronauts to sign, you know, to swear in a Bible that they walked on the moon when everybody knows they didn't walk on the moon? Neil Young, he's another phony baloney. Neil Armstrong didn't walk on the moon, okay? And Buzz Aldrin didn't walk on the moon. And we know Mike Collins didn't. He never said he did. But we don't even know if he was in space, because he doesn't know if there's stars. So I have a feeling that Mike Collins hasn't been, you know, more than 35,000 feet above the Earth. You know, when he got tossed out the back of a Lockheed Constellation airplane so he could splash down near Wake Island for the Richard Nixon meeting. Anyway, so you have the situation with John Lennon and Yoko Ono doing the bed-in for peace at a Hilton Hotel in Amsterdam. That was on March 26, 1969. Then the next thing that happens, we have a little pause, and then Alan Klein, a Jewish man from Newark, New Jersey, he's signed to represent the Beatles. Now, they've been operating without a manager for several years. Brian Epstein was murdered in August 1967, so they've managed to... Now, don't you think that's interesting that the Beatles had enormous success during 1968 and 1969? Enormous. And they had no manager. They were most successful without a manager, because I'm here to tell you, of course they had a manager. They had George Martin, and they had the suits that guaranteed the records, and they had the Tavistock Institute with professional music songwriters, so that they were super productive during 1967 and 68, and they had no Brian Epstein. So the manager doesn't contribute to the success of the Beatles. They're the fake manager, which is what Brian Epstein was. He was compromised and controlled. And evidently, he was sassing authority, and they wiped him out in his bed in Sussex, England, 65 miles south of where Roberto Calfi and Judy Garland were murdered. 65 miles south exactly, we said goodbye to Brian Epstein. And Paul McCartney and John Lennon continued on until they basically got married and torpedoed the Beatles, because the Beatles never appeared together live ever again after January 1969. So Paul McCartney got married first on March 13th, 1969. Then John Lennon and Yoko Ono got married on March 20th. Then we had the bed-in for peace on the 26th of March, which is 6 days after the wedding. Then they hired Alan Klein, who had ripped off the Rolling Stones for at least $1 million stolen, and had ripped off Lawrence and Edie Gourmet, and also ripped off Sam Cooke. And yet Paul McCartney and John Lennon and Yoko Ono really wanted, it was Yoko Ono's idea to hire Alan Klein, a Jewish man from Newark, New Jersey. Anyway, be that as it may, the Beatles never performed together again under the management of Alan Klein. All he really did was take the music from Let It Be that was in the can to Phil Spector in Los Angeles, and then they redubbed it and redid it, and then they issued the Let It Be album, and so that was the last Beatles album, I believe, the Let It Be album. And because Abbey Road and the songs that are on Let It Be album were recorded before Alan Klein was the manager of the Beatles. So Alan Klein was not involved with the creation of Let It Be or Abbey Road. However, he got paid on those productions because I don't think they've been distributed yet. So I'm telling you, he's 37 years old and he's not to be trusted, but he's the Beatles manager. Doesn't really matter because you have the real manager is RCA Victor and CBS. They're the real manager of the money from the music. All right, then the next thing that happens is that that Yoko Ono and John Lennon are being told by the clandestine services to do another Bet-In for Peace because they should do it in, the North American continent. So they want to do it in New York City. That's the number one city of the United States. But they can't because John Lennon has a marijuana conviction. So he can't get his passport approved. But they'll let him into CIA Canada, no problem. So they go to Montreal, or they go to the Queen Elizabeth Hotel in Montreal off the St. Lawrence River. And they have the Bet-In for Peace 2, Part 2. That is on, I believe it started on May 24th, 1969. Timothy Leary rolls into town with his first of 5 wives. Timothy Leary was married and divorced 5 times. And I think this was wife number 1 or 2. Timothy Leary is 48 years old. He arrives into town. He's been working with Abigail Folger's mother in San Francisco for the last 4 to 5 years. He's been working closely with Abigail Folger's mother because she pays him money to do his job with psilocybin and tune in, turn on, drop out, Timothy Leary. So he's CIA, and Abigail Folger's mother is CIA banking, and that means that Yoko Ono is CIA, and she's controlling John Lennon, who is now CIA, even though he doesn't want to be CIA. He doesn't want to be British intelligence either, but he's singing Tavistock music with Tavistock lyrics. So John Lennon has become a Sharon Tate, if you haven't figured that out. John Lennon got turned into Sharon Tate. He didn't volunteer for it. He just wanted to be famous. So they made a deal with the devil. And John Lennon is Sharon Tate. He's the male version of Sharon Tate. In other words, he's not going with the program, but he's now been babysat by Yoko Ono, who he hardly knows her. And there they are doing the Bet-In for Peace in Montreal, Canada, off the St. Lawrence River. So that's on May 26th that Timothy Leary makes the scene. There are other luminaries who appear there. All CIA-controlled staged event. Keyword staged. Staged event. So, Yoko Ono is CIA. Paul McCartney is CIA. John Lennon is CIA. I mean, they didn't volunteer, but they've been integrated in through infiltration, not invasion. But they're all controlled, too. They're all controlled. They all have controllers. Paul McCartney, his power of attorney is with Leopold Epstein. That's the boss of Paul McCartney, and he's sleeping with the daughter of his attorney, Linda. That's as controlled as you can possibly get while you still have a pulse. Then, what happens next? Okay, June 22nd, 1969. Judy Garland is murdered by acute barbiturate poisoning in central London at age 47. Yeah, exactly the same way that Marilyn Monroe was killed. The exact same way that Inger Stevens gets killed a few years later. I'm skipping ahead, but anyway, Judy Garland gets murdered in central London on June 22nd, 1969. The next thing that happens is we have the 4th of July, America's birthday in the United States. July 4th, 1969. We have the official Zodiac murder the first Zodiac official murder. There were 2 murders that were performed in December 1968. Nobody knew anything about Zodiac or the Zodiac killings. They were just 2 teenagers, aged 16 and 17, murdered on Lake Herman Road in 1968, or on or around December 20th, 1968. Anyway, nobody knows anything about the Zodiac, but they do after July 4th, 1969, because there are 4 letters that are delivered to the William Randolph Hearst newspaper and the DeYoung Brothers newspaper. One's the Chronicle, which is the morning edition, and then one's the afternoon edition known as the Examiner. Though William Randolph Hearst had the afternoon Examiner edition, and the DeYoungs had the Chronicle morning edition. And letters were sent to both editors at both newspapers, which used the same printing press, by the way. I'm pretty sure they used the same P.O. box. If you want to write a letter to the Examiner and you send it to the DeYoung Chronicle by mistake, they'll get it to the right place, because they're both controlled by the CIA. All right. Anyway, so that killed Darlene Ferrin, age 22, with a 9mm pistol. And cartridges were left, but not all the cartridges. Some were picked up and some were left in the passenger seat of the car, where the killer reached in to shoot Darlene in the driver's seat of her Corvair. And Michael Michaud was in the rear seat, which is kind of a question mark how that happened. And he was shot multiple times with 9mm, but he didn't die. He did not die. Next thing that happens is 11 days later, on July 15th, 1969, which is a Tuesday, in West Hollywood, John Zwyer, age 33, is shot to death with a .38 caliber pistol in the back of his head, sitting beside his swimming pool around lunchtime in West Hollywood. He is the son-in-law of Art Linkleter, who's the #1 television celebrity for children's programming for CBS. And he does 25 years for CBS. He knows Sharon Tate. He knows Tom Coomer, J. Sebring. He knows, Buddy Ebsen. He knows Ronald Reagan. He knows Bob Cummins. He knows Fess Parker. He knows everybody in Hollywood. He did 25 years with CBS Television. He did 19 years with NBC Television. And he also did radio, and he also did film, and he also participated in Disney Studios. And he knows Roy Disney, who lives in Toluca Lake, which is Burbank, Studio City. And then he also knows Walt Disney, who lives in Holmby Hills, which is over where Sharon Tate was murdered, but didn't live. Walt Disney lived in Benedict Canyon, Holmby Hills section of Benedict Canyon, close to Sunset Boulevard. It's important for you to know that Sharon Tate did not live in Benedict Canyon, and neither did Abigail Folger. She didn't live there either. She lived in Laurel Canyon. Well, she had a house, a Rand Corporation house. All right. So after the Zodiac murder of Darlene Ferrin in the city of Vallejo, inside the city, at the Blue Rock Springs parking lot, we have the John Zwyer, who's married to Dawn, who's the second eldest of Art Linkleter. His oldest is a son for Jack. Jack Linklater's the oldest. He had several television shows in Hollywood of his own and starred on many episodes with his father, as did Diane and Robert, his younger children. But anyway, so Dawn discovers her husband dead at the swimming pool in West Hollywood by a .38 caliber pistol. Immediately the next day, Wednesday, we have the Apollo 11 moon launch starring Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin from West Point, and Mike Collins from West Point. And Neil Armstrong has a very similar background as did Gus Grisham. Gus Grisham went to Purdue University, and then he went into the Air Force. Neil Armstrong went to Purdue University. He's 38 years old. He's going to be 39 in a couple weeks. But anyway, he went to Purdue, and then he went to the United States Army Airborne, and he didn't stay long, and he was switched out to the Air Force and then NASA. So pretty similar. Gus Grisham, Neil Armstrong, on paper, very similar. He had 3 children. He had 3 children at the time of the moon mission. He had 3 children. That means he can be controlled. He's a military man. He follows orders, and he has a lot to lose. A wife and 3 children. Buzz Aldrin has 3 children and a wife. So he can be easily controlled. Plus, he's a West Point man. They're very good at following orders. Mike Collins, he has a wife and children also, and he's a West Point. So not a problem. So they go up and do their thing, and if you believe that. So I don't believe that they went anywhere, other than to the Hornet deck. The aircraft carrier that wasn't. The USS Hornet was not an aircraft carrier. It was a supply ship that they put a deck on, and then they, it's like putting lipstick on a pig and calling it an Arabian racehorse. That's what the USS Hornet was. Anyway, Richard Nixon was there for the fake reuniting episode where they had to put the moon astronauts into the Airstream trailer because they have COVID, right? They had space goodies. Remember? They did the COVID operation with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin and Mike Collins and Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon wasn't wearing a face diaper, and he did a photo op with the other guys that are in this little Airstream trailer, right? At the second deck, which I've personally been to, by the way. I've been on the Hornet. That's why I know a little bit about the Hornet. They even painted Neil Armstrong's footprints from where he got off the elevator and walked over to where the Airstream trailer was. That's how the CIA, likes to memorialize their pranks that they pull. Because that's a prank, okay? They didn't have space goodies. They didn't go into space. They didn't go to the moon. And they don't have COVID, all right? So to stop with the COVID hoax, all right? They were doing that in 1969. And to be specific, they did it on July 24th, 1969. They did that space cootie bullshit with Richard Nixon. All right, the next thing that happens is we have the Sharon Tate, Abigail Folger murder by the M7 bayonet. The next day, on the 10th of August, we have the murder of Lino LaBianca, who stands 6'2", 235 pounds. He's a money launderer for the Straight Satans, motorcycle club for the CIA for drug deals, and he gets stabbed 10 times to his chest, and he has his wrist tied behind his back with the sheath holster, which is this leatherette was used, 43 inches to tie Lino's wrist. Now, I think Lino was knocked unconscious with the stun gun and chloroformed. Yeah, just they were afraid if he woke up, he would get upset, right? So it's a lot easier to stab someone to their chest if they're knocked out. And his wife, Rosemary, looks like she wasn't knocked out because she was stabbed 41 times, kind of like an Abigail Folger situation and a Wojtek Frykowski. They were fleeing. They were attempting to flee, so they got more wounds. Lino made no defensive efforts whatsoever, had no defensive wounds, despite the fact that he had 6 loaded guns in that house, 2 rifles and 4 pistols. But he never made it to those weapons. And he's a military police trained Army soldier who served 3 years in Europe during World War II and 1 year after World War II. NATO trained, and I believe NATO soldiers killed Lino LaBianca and killed Sharon Tate and killed Abigail Folger. All right. Then the next thing that happens was that the Apollo astronauts conduct their first television interview on the 12th of August, which I believe is that's a Monday, because the 11th is Sunday. Let me get this straight. So the 9th is Saturday, the 10th is Sunday, the Monday is the 11th, and Tuesday is the 12th. So on the Tuesday, 1969, the Apollo press conference is held where it appears that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin and Mike Collins have robbed the bank, and they're looking around to make sure that the police aren't, waiting to arrest them. Because it certainly didn't look like a NBA championship champagne uncorking show where they pour the champagne over each other, that they went to the moon and back. It looked more like they robbed a bank and they didn't want to get arrested. That's my unprofessional assessment of the fake interview. Then on the 17th of August, Walter Cronkite, the biggest pathological liar of CBS. See, if you're a moon landing believer, you got a major problem. You got a lot of problems. You have no telemetry data, so you can't prove that you went to the moon. Number two is you have Walter Cronkite, who's your number one cheerleader. Walter Cronkite, he's never told the truth about a single CIA story in his life, ever. He's a pathological liar for William S. Paley. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted voice in America. I wouldn't trust him as far as I could throw him, okay? He's an odious creep. He believes in one world order. He believes in Agenda 21. He doesn't believe in democracy. He's a complete owned tool. He's a college dropout. He never graduated from University of Texas. No, he didn't. Anyway, my point is that he conducts a one-on-one interview with Neil Armstrong to, I guess, anchor bias, which is what he does, to validate the moon landing, where he does pin down Neil Armstrong if he's a Christian or a believer in God. And I guess Neil hemmed and hawed and said, well, and then Walter asked, are you an atheist? He goes, well, I'm definitely not an atheist, but I don't believe in God. So you can take whatever Neil Armstrong said as secret coded message or whatever. Then the next thing that happened is we have another Zodiac killing on September 27th, 1969 at Oak Shores Day Use Park on Lake Berryessa off of Knoxville Road. Now, that's a complicated thing. I know the road intimately. It's known as Berryessa Knoxville Road. It's known as Knoxville Grade Road. Where the Zodiac killing is, I guess it's known as Berryessa Knoxville Road. I always call it Knoxville Grade Road because it has a brutal climb about 15 miles north of the murder scene. It's brutal. It takes about an hour, almost an hour to get over it. And then there's a series of 20-minute climbs after that before you dive down to Clear Lake and Lower Lake, the city of Lower Lake, Clear Lake, which I know that area really well too. It's very remote. So in this episode of Zodiac, we have Cecilia Shepard it appears that she is bayoneted to death about a dozen times. And again, there's a boy that doesn't die who's also stabbed. And his name is, it's funny, I know these names and then I forget them because it's so long ago. Cecilia Shepard dies. I think she's 21 years old, and they go to Pacific Union College, which is a Seventh-day Adventist school, not too far from the murder site. And that is where it's Cecilia Shepard dies. She bleeds out on the way to the hospital in Napa, California. Brian Hartnell survives, and he gives kind of a confusing eyewitness account of what happened. So anyway, I'm not going to comment any further on Brian Hartnell, but I'm not, as typical with CI operations, things are confusing. They're not crystal clear. And Brian Hartnell, he's kind of slippery for having not died when you're lying next to a woman who's stabbed to death more times than you were. They had their wrist tied behind their back by clothesline, nylon clothesline. All right. Then the next thing that happens is getting back to Art Linkletter, his daughter Diane, age 20, she gets tossed out of her apartment, 6th floor at the Shoreham Towers, West Hollywood. Again, the same general area that his son-in-law had just been murdered with a .38 caliber pistol. Remember, John Zwyer was killed in West Hollywood in July 15th, and here we are, October 4th. It's just barely 2 months after the Sharon Tate murder, who Art Linkletter knows her, and his 20-year-old daughter Diane is thrown to her death on the sidewalk of North Horn Avenue, which is directly, and I mean directly across the street from 1211 North Horn Avenue. That's a 16-unit apartment building with 750 square foot, 1-bedroom, 1-bath units that houses CIA operatives. In other words, Diane Linklater is murdered in front of a CIA residential housing facility apartment across the street from her luxury Shoreham Towers It's at the corner of Shoreham Avenue and I think it's an avenue, Shoreham Drive and North Horn Avenue. It's a CIA neighborhood. And Diane Linklater dies in, they take her to a Hollywood hospital and then to USC, where Judge Older went and where George Lucas went, where Lina LaBianca got a finance degree from. They took her to the hospital over there and she died dead on arrival at USC. Diane Linklater died on arrival. So who knows where she died? Probably died in the ambulance. They could have put her down anywhere. They weren't going to let her survive the 6th floor fall. That happens on October 4th, 1969. Then we have the next thing is I'm going to wrap it up. This is my 16th event. We have Altamont Raceway free concert that Bill Graham promoted but didn't show up for. He wasn't present. That was December 6, 1969. And of course, we had Rolling Stones and Mick Jagger singing Sympathy for the Devil at the exact moment that age 18 Meredith Hunter was bayoneted to death by a bayonet. Don't know that it was this one, the M7, but it probably was. Okay, and that's on Saturday, December 6, 1969. And that pretty much concluded the rockin' 1960s. No more 1960s after Altamont. And in this story, you will be not surprised to know, I guess I skipped, the Milai Massacre was reported as a news story in September 1969. Even though I already told you it happened 18 months earlier on March 16th, 1968, but it was presented by Walter Cronkite in September, before the second Zodiac killing. We had the Milai Massacre and blaming it all on William Cowley, who's kind of the Charlie Manson of Charlie Company, right? Charlie Company, Charlie Manson, Charlie Watson, Charlie Older, the judge, the hanging judge. Look how many Charleses there are in 1969. Charles Older, Flying Tiger Ace. Charlie Company, Milai Massacre. Charlie Manson, whose real name is Maddox. That's what it said on his birth certificate, Maddox. Charles Miles Maddox. And his father is Scott. But he goes by Manson. Charlie. Charlie Company. They used the M7 bayonet at Charlie Company. They used the M7 bayonet for the Sharon Tate murders. We used the M7 bayonet, it looks like, at Lake Berryessa off Knoxville Grade, off Oak Shores, at Twin Oak Point. And it looks like we used it at the Altamont Raceway to murder Meredith Hunter, age 18, who had also appeared at the Monterey Pop Festival when he was only 15 years old. So he is a CIA operative, Meredith Hunter. So you see, the victims are CIA. The victims are CIA. The murderers are NATO or CIA. It's CIA on CIA crime. I forgot about Paul Stein. He was killed in Nancy Pelosi and Paul Pelosi's neighborhood, and Dianne Feinstein was living there too. And so was Sharon Tate's father in Presidio Heights. All four of those people, Dianne Feinstein, Nancy Pelosi, Paul Pelosi, Sharon Tate's father, all living in Presidio Heights, okay? And Paul Stein, age 29, gets murdered on October 11th at the corner of Washington and Cherry Streets. Right there. It's walking distance to Haight-Ashbury, walking distance to St. Ignatius High School, where Paul Pelosi attended high school. It's University of San Francisco Jesuit, parochial elementary school, St. Agnes parochial school, walking distance to the Paul Stein final Zodiac murder. That one's for sure CIA because we get Melvin Belli involved and ABC News, KGO Radio, they're all over that story, to promote the maximum terror so that people in New York will be afraid, even though there's nothing to be afraid of. It's a CIA clandestine military intelligence murder right next door to an Army base, the Presidio Army base, and Letterman Bioweapons Laboratory, right there. All right, I guess that's it. There's a grand total of 16 CIA events that I've recited for 1969. And I'm sure there were hundreds more that I didn't address. And you can only use your imagination for 2022, how many events there were. And I'm not really, my mind is still spinning for about the face diapers and the mandatory vax and all of the crazy lunacy of getting rid of cash. You know, they're going to outlaw cash, and they're going to close ATM machines, and they're going to close branch banks to make you utterly dependent on the digital passport. But if you disconnect the mesh, then your digital passport won't work, and you'll have no money, and there'll be no banks. But you know what? You can remember who your bankers were and where they lived. So I'm going to say, if you run out of money or they freeze your account, just go to a banker's house, because I know they have money, so they could loan you some money. Sure, just like A.P. Giannini did when he started Bank of America, when it was known as the Bank of Italy. Thanks for listening. Have a great day. Talk to you soon.